So thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy evenings to come and listen to what Dave and I both have to say. So what I'm going to do is I'll actually take. I think I'm going to do like Dave did. I'm going to take questions at a few key spots throughout the presentation, as well as at the end, because there's a lot of ideas. So I'm just going to blast you. So my apologies for doing that. So anyways, what I want to do is give you a very brief overview of a very deep topic, Discipline Agile. So, as you heard, my name is Scott Ambler. I'm the co-creator, along with Mark Lyons, of the Discipline Agile Toolkit, and Al Shalloway is actively involved now as well, as you heard from Dominic. And I'll show how Flex fits into all this and how we've integrated it into the toolkit. And I've been doing Agile pretty much from the very beginning, and I've been helping organizations around the world to understand and apply this Agile and Lean stuff in a very wide range of situations. And so I've been lucky enough to see to have a wide range of experiences and to see how Agile gets applied. And I was the thought leader of the Agile modeling method back in the day, and the Agile data method as well. So I took on a lot of the harder but not so sexy topics in the Agile community, things that a lot of people were trying to ignore or hope would go away, but modeling documentation never went away. Of course, data never went away. So all very important topics. So anyways, and then all that led to what eventually became the Discipline Agile Toolkit. So I'm going to start. Last week, I was I presented to the Agile and Lean DC group here. So I off the cuff, I used rutabagas as an example. So I'm going to start with a rutabaga question for you. So I would invite people to start thinking about how you go about cooking rutabagas, because that's basically my next slide. I'm going to get into why you should be interested in DA, what it's all about. I'll briefly talk about guided continuous improvement. So one of the things about being a change maker is, well, what the heck changes? What changes should you be making? Can we get better at identifying potential changes to make? And I think that's a very important thing for all of us to learn. And this is in many ways the heart of what Discipline Agile is all about. So anyways, let's get into the critical topic of the evening, which is, of course, rutabagas. So the question I want to put out to everybody, and so please start typing in the chat. What's your best practice for cooking rutabagas? So I'll give you a minute to see what's going on. I'll bring up the chat if I can, and where'd the chat go? There we go. So researching on Google, looking up recipes on Google, peeling and roasting, cutting and steaming, no clue. Never cooked one. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Leanna loves them. Roasting olive oil and rosemary. Carmelita's a fan or friend, perhaps, of Martha Stewart. Oh, getting closer. Barbara is getting closer to a recipe. Have someone else do it. Okay, I'll give it 10 more seconds. Make them to fries. That could be okay. Okay, I suspect Tina's a consultant. Her answer was it depends, and that's pretty much the answer. So it does depend. So there is no such thing as a best practice. So if you noticed how a reasonably simple and straightforward thing, the cooking of a vegetable, we had many answers. So I asked you for best practices, and I got several different strategies out of you for cooking rutabagas. I was actually surprised, nobody said no, no, just don't. For those, I'm sure a few of you have childhood memories of or childhood nightmares of being forced to eat rutabagas. But anyways, so the question is, how do you cook rutabagas? And the answer is there's many different ways. It depends on the context. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. It depends on who you're serving them to. So several of you, said, somebody said, mash them with rosemary or something. I'm sure that's a great strategy. I love rosemary. I'm sure that's a great thing. But what happens if somebody's allergic to rosemary, right? So we need to worry about these things, and we need to understand the context of what we're trying to achieve. Is this a side dish, or is this going to be the main meal? Is this a lunch or a dinner thing? perhaps. So there's many different situations. Are we desperately trying to feed this to children, or are adults going to be eating this? Because for those of you who cook, cooking for adults tends to be you have a wider range of options, shall we say, than when cooking for young children. So anyway, there is no best practice for cooking rutabaga. My experience in life is that there is no such thing as a best practice. This is a marketing term, that any given practice has advantages and disadvantages, works well in some situations, and is a phenomenally bad idea in others. So the issue then becomes, how do we choose the most appropriate way of doing something given the context that we face? And that, because we all face different contexts. So for example, when it comes to cooking rutabagas, some of us live in families where the people love rutabagas. Some of us don't know what rutabagas are. Some of us have children that they're not going to eat this thing no matter how you cook it. Others, we've got adult family members that probably aren't going to eat this either. So it is what it is. So it really depends on the context. So the implication of this is, because we are all unique people facing unique situations, I can't tell you what the best practice for doing anything is, because it really does depend. Tina had the right answer. Tina was the person with the right answer. It depends on the situation that you face. So this is the challenge from a process point of view. This is a huge challenge from a change maker point of view, because you don't do change for change's sake. You make change to improve things, for things to hopefully get better. And sometimes, you make a change and it, with all good intentions, but then it blows up in your face. But anyways, you are at least trying to have a positive change, and hopefully if the change is negative, then you back out of it as quickly as you can. So no such thing as a best practice. So please keep this in mind. And this has an interesting implication. So Dominic was earlier saying how I was basically preaching to the choir when he heard me talk, because I was more than likely ranting about the evils of best practices. And this is the challenge with the frameworks. Everybody's looking for an easy answer. They just want to just tell me what to do. Tell me how to do this agile thing. Oh, good, let's go off and learn Scrum. Or oh, good, let's go off and learn SAFe, or less, or any of the frameworks. And the challenge is that the frameworks each solve a certain problem in a certain way. So if you have that problem, and you're in the context that actually that solution will work, then the framework's probably a good idea. At least it's a good start. But if you don't have that problem, or if the context simply isn't right, then adopting a framework isn't going to get the job done. So for example, if my wife was allergic to rosemary and I adopted that recipe involving rosemary, that would probably be a very bad thing. So we would need to, we need to rethink this. So all these practices, all these frameworks should be adopted in the right context. But do you know how to do that? And what do you do if you're not in that context? Or what do you do if you were in that context, but now the situation has changed? You've learned, the marketplace changes, a pandemic sweeps through, there's changes, right? So the one size does not fit all. So in order to be an effective change maker, you need to learn how to make change, and you need to learn how to do it effectively and to make better decisions. And this is what the DA toolkit is all about. It's not about telling you this is the one official best practice to rule them all, because this is not a Tolkien situation. Instead, it's all about teaching you how to improve, how to get better at getting better. So anyway, so why Discipline Agile? Well, I pretty much answered that question just now with the rutabagas. Who knew how I could get like 5 minutes out of rutabagas? So how effective are frameworks? So this I think is a valid question, right? So yes, I'm basically saying that frameworks might not be as good as they're claimed, but they do seem to be working out well for some people. So how well is it? And there's all these wonderful marketing claims, but marketing claims are marketing claims. So I'm a firm believer, I'm a bit of a quant, and I'm a firm believer in looking at research, and hopefully unbiased research. So where do we go for real numbers? Because the purveyors of the frameworks, it's all marketing, right? You got to sort of take it with a grain of salt. But is there a source of information that we can trust? So I believe I found one, so I'm going to share it with you. So let's assume that you're adopting a framework like Scrum or Safe or Less or whatever, and you're in a situation where that decision makes sense. And let's also assume that you were able to adopt it effectively. So what happens? What does that look like? Well, when you first adopt a new framework or a new way of working at all, there's an initial learning curve. You got to get training, get some help learning it. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to sort of stumble around a bit. But eventually things get better. Let's assume that you're on a good track. So things get better and you improve and you become more, your team or your organization becomes more effective. But you hit the limits of the framework because each of these frameworks solve a certain problem. And once you've solved that problem, the frameworks really don't have anything more for you. And there's all this wonderful rhetoric of, yes, the art of the possible, and you can do anything, you can tailor it yourself, you're really smart, you can do it. And yeah, that's true, but there's no advice, there's no help. None of the frameworks tell you how to move away from the framework. That would be a bad business proposition for them. They're never going to do that. That's not a good business model. So, there's a lot of hand waving, but that's about it. So Ivar Yakobsen likes to say that you end up in method prison or in framework jail, that because you've hit the boundaries of what the frameworks does now, and now you're back to, now I got to figure it out. I got to make another change. I got to figure this out now. But things have gotten better. So how much better? Well, there's a researcher, Dr. Don Reifer. He earned his PhD in answering the question, exploring the question, how effective is Agile in practice? What's actually going on out there? Not all the marketing claims, not all this wishful thinking from the purists, but what's actually happening. So he did his PhD in this. He then turned it into a business. And he's continuing his research. He's a consultant. He works with organizations, and he continues to publish. So the thing I like about his work, well, first of all, it's been vetted. He had to earn his PhD, so at a good school. So his work's been vetted, as you can see, and this stage is a little bit old now, but the many different teams and a wide range of organizations around the world. So statistically significant, and most importantly, he's not biased, at least not framework biased. So he's not a Scrum guy. He's not a Safe guy. He's not a Discipline Agile guy. He's not a Less guy. He's a researcher, and he doesn't have an axe to grind. So as a result, he's coming from a trustworthy place. So anyways, we're seeing that there is benefit from adopting these methods and these frameworks. Now, these are averages, so some organizations are doing better than others, but on average, we're seeing a 7 to 12% productivity boost. That's not bad. It's nothing to complain about, but it might not be the, you can do double the work in half the time promise that you might have heard, or the 10x promise that you've probably heard from in some case studies. And to be fair, I've seen like 10x productivity improvements in some teams, but that was not because of the framework, is because they were just so messed up. Doing anything would help them. And I think this is the challenge that we see, right? We've got to look at what's actually going on out there, as opposed to some of these more extreme case studies that we read about. But anyway, so 7 to 12%, that's nothing to sneeze at. But maybe we can do better. I'm going to walk you through how to do better. So Discipline Agile is an agnostic toolkit, and there's some interesting implications of that, which I'll talk about. But we look at a wide range of sources of information. So, we adopt great ideas from Scrum and from Kanban and from the PMBOK guide and from ITIL and Safe and many, many other sources, because there's a lot of great ideas out there. And what we do is we put them in a context. So we help you to identify the strategies, the techniques that will more than likely work for you in the situation that you face. So we help you decide, we help you to identify and then choose potential changes, potential new ways of working that will work, that you believe will work for you in the situation that you face. So we can up your game, help you to up your game, basically. So what's Discipline Agile? And I'll go a couple more slides and I'll open up for questions. So Discipline Agile is a toolkit, not just a framework. And it's all about helping you to make better decisions, to help you choose your own way of working, because you are unique. You are all unique people. As a result, you work on unique teams, because each team is a collection of unique people, and you face a unique situation. So, my team is we have our outcome, we're our people, we're trying to achieve our goals, working in our situation. Your team has the same thing. So different teams are in different situations. So you want to have a fit for purpose approach, a fit for purpose way of working. And because your situation will evolve over time, you want to also be able to evolve your way of working over time as you learn, as as the marketplace changes, as your priorities change, and so on. So Discipline Agile is an umbrella. So there's thousands of practices and strategies out there. Many of which are presented as best practices, but as I said, I've yet to run into a best practice. I've run into probably thousands of things that have been presented to me as best practices, but I've never actually run into an actual best practice. I hope to one day, but I'm not holding out any great hope for that. But anyways, interesting questions though, along the lines of, well, what practices are out there? Which ones should I do in my situation? Which ones should I not do? How do they fit together? To what extent should I do them? So these are all interesting questions that you need to answer, because the real thing here is you want to pull these ingredients, these practices off the shelf, combine them into your way of working. Just like you pick ingredients out of your pantry, or you go to the market and you buy ingredients and then you make dinner from them tonight. And then you will have, your dinner will be unique compared to the person down the street from you. Fair enough. Right? You're picking from the same ingredient. You might be shopping in the same market, but you'll pick a different combination of ingredients. And even if you had the exact same ingredients, just out of pure luck, you'd probably combine them in different ways. Because as we saw, there's many ways of cooking, rutabagas, like a simple, straightforward vegetable. And yet we heard many different ways of cooking rutabagas. So actually, any questions about that? I'll open up for questions.
One quick question, Scott. With all of the things out there that you mentioned, some from XP and from Scrum and from Safe, and there's not a single best practice, but there was a process or criteria that I assume you use to decide whether to include something in Discipline Agile or not. So what was that criteria? What did you use to decide something? This is something that's not going to be perfect for everybody, but is a useful thing to include in choose your way of working.
Yeah, definitely. So a couple things we would look for named practices or named strategies. So test-driven development, for example, I could point to books and many articles about that. Mob programming, same thing. OKR, same sort of thing. And it didn't have to be like a single book about the topic. It could have been a technique that appeared in, like in PMBOK Guide, for example. So, very, EVM or and various aspects of EVM. Now, obviously, there's EVM books, but say there wasn't, EVM would be still fair game because, I mentioned EVM and most of you probably know what I'm talking about. So it has to be a named practice. Ideally, we want to have seen it in several situations, or at least have worked with people who have applied it and can intelligently tell us about it. Because we want to identify the advantages and disadvantages. When, because we're trying to answer the question, when would you do it? When would you not do that? Basically, to help you decide, does this make sense for me? So that's basically what we're looking for. And it has to be of interest in the domain. So, for example, my wife likes to knit. We don't have any knitting practices in Discipline Agile. Knitting is out of scope at the present moment. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll have knitting, but probably not. So anyway, there's basic scoping. That's the base of the scoping logic.
And then also there's a question from the chat window. Is Discipline Agile a collection of frameworks from which a PM or team chooses to apply to a problem?
Close. It's a collection of practices and ways to choose those practices. Now, the practices appear in the frameworks and methods. So, for example, there's a collection of practices in Scrum, like having daily coordination, what they call a daily Scrum meeting, but we would call a daily coordination meeting because we want to be agnostic and, frankly, we want to be descriptive as well. So we abandon some of the marketing rhetoric. But so think of a method or a framework as a collection of practices. In DA, we would go in and harvest those practices, pull them out, put them into context to let you decide which aspects of that. So we don't fall into this, we're doing Scrum but or we're doing Safe but type nonsense. Nobody cares. It's wonderful marketing arguments, but nobody cares if you're doing Scrum perfectly. The real issue is, are you getting value? Are you doing the best you can in the situation that you face? And if that means I need to pull 3 or 4 practices at a Scrum and a few ideas from here and a few ideas from there and a few ideas from there, fine, let's do that. And then learn and evolve from there. Yeah. But having said that, we also have life cycles. So, and a life cycle is a collection, or it's sort of like the glue that holds together a bunch of practices. So you can sort of say that the life cycles are sort of methody in a way. They're still sort of fuzzy though, so they're not really a solid method, but they're almost a method. They're quasi method. And we have a couple that are based on Scrum, but they go way beyond Scrum because Scrum is not sufficient. And the Scrum folks are clear about that, right? They purposely don't address technical issues at all, for example, right? Fair enough. But you need to, right? If you're a software development team, you would need to address testing and architecture and many other things. If you were a marketing team, you would have to address marketing stuff and how to run experiments in the marketplace and how to gather data and all these other marketing things that marketing teams do. And you would have to pull those, you'd have to find those techniques somehow. So instead of just sort of throwing you to the wolves, so Scrum basically says, adopt Scrum, this is awesome. And then you're really smart, you can find all these other practices that you need. And yeah, you could do that, but that's pretty onerous. And how are you going to find the ones that are right for you? Like, unless you're a process expert, right? Like this is sort of where the Agile rhetoric falls apart. So, if you look back to when Agile first came about in 2001, one of the very significant philosophies was that a team should own its own process, that a team should be allowed to choose its own way of working, which is how we would call it in modern times. But there was an underlying assumption that you were a process expert. So all these methods like Scrum and extreme programming and Agile modeling and others were coming from process people. So we all thought that, of course, you could own your own process because you're obviously a process expert too. Why wouldn't you be? It's totally awesome being a process guy. But that assumption simply isn't true. And believe me, you don't want to be a process person. So,
I feel like process and specifically Six Sigma, super popular in the 90s. It probably peaked, between 2000, 2005. I don't see it that much anymore. So I wonder if there's just been a kind of a transition away from process engineering and companies focusing on that.
I think it depends on your domain. I would argue that Six Sigma is still pretty relevant in the manufacturing domain.
Sure. Yeah. Good point.
It depends. Yeah, it depends on where you're working. I think Six Sigma was applied further beyond its appropriate scope in many organizations. So if you're manufacturing things, then Six Sigma is definitely a phenomenally good idea. But if you're more of a, if you look at PMI, right? We're dealing with intellectual property and fuzzy. We're dealing with fuzzy things. Six Sigma is not the way to go there.
Yeah.
So
several more good questions. If I'm already selecting from toolkit frameworks for a project, am I doing disciplined agile already?
Yeah, well, arguably, so disciplined agile came about from the observation that teams were doing this, right? Because the rhetoric from all the framework people were always, fill in the gaps. You're smart, you can do it, and that's what people do. So any organization that claims they're doing Scrum is doing way more than just Scrum, because Scrum is not sufficient for anything. So you've done that work. Right. So a software team that's doing Scrum has also picked up practices maybe from XP, from Agile modeling, and they might not even know it, right? They might have just randomly Googled things. They might have been coached in things, but it was sort of a haphazard approach to figuring out your wow. And that's really, it's better than nothing, but it's hard to do. It's expensive and it's slow, and it really generally doesn't work out unless you just happen to have some fairly good process people and you happen to listen to them, because both those things don't always happen. So that's the situation there. So arguably you're probably bootstrapping on your own. But if you're doing that, you probably would be helped greatly by DA. We often run into people that say they stumble into DA somehow, and they say, "Oh, I wish I had this 5 years ago. It would have solved so many problems." Or, I wish my Scrum coach had told me about this, because all these things that we're struggling with right now, they're in this book. And it's really, it's unfortunate that people sort of stumble into it, as opposed to find it on their own. But we'll get better at marketing.
And I don't want to steal your thunder, but I know later you're going to talk about continuous guided improvement, and I think that's a kind of a key element. So I'll the person that asked the question, if they stick around for the next 20 minutes, they'll get a lot more answers.
I get it. Okay, so let's go to the next section. So the one of the things we did in DA is originally we adopted the Agile Manifesto, which was actually the manifesto for Agile software development, written 20 years ago, and actually 20 years almost to the day. And that was great, but that reflected the problem. It solved the problems of 20 years ago in the software field. But we've gone way beyond, we've learned a few things in 20 years, and we've gone way beyond software. So in DA, about 10 years ago, we decided to extend the manifesto, because the challenge with the Agile Manifesto was that the original authors decided not to change it. So it's one of the great ironies in software engineering that for a group of people that just can't shut up about the need to change, they refuse to change. So good for them. That's their decision. Good for them. But we weren't constrained by that. So we wrote what we called the Discipline Agile Manifesto to extend the original Agile Manifesto. But then over the years, that got a little bit clunky, because the formatting in the manifesto just wasn't getting the job done. It was okay, but it really wasn't getting the job done. And we also had the other problem that other people were starting to also extend the manifesto, but in different directions. And it was all good work, good for them. But then we would get in these weird arguments of, my manifesto can beat up your manifesto, and people would want to start arguing about, how many angels can dance on the head of an Agile pin and stuff like that. So it was really getting dysfunctional. So about a year and a half ago, we stepped back and we asked the question, well, if we were to write a manifesto today, or if we were to define the mindset for business agility today, how would we do it? With no limits, right? So this is what we came up with. So we decided to capture the mindset in terms of a collection of principles, which we'd actually, and most of these we had in DA for a long, long time. So we believe in these collections of principles, things like we want to delight our customers. We want to have awesome teams. We believe that context counts, because we can observe that everybody's in different situations, that people are unique and people are in different situations. So choice is good. We want to be able to choose our way of working. We want to organize around products and services. So we want to stay focused on what are we trying to bring to our customers. So because we believe in these principles, and we also believe in enterprise awareness. This is absolutely critical. So one of the great things that Agile brought to the table was this focus on teams. So we started moving away from the individual to teams. But then in Discipline Agile, we choose to observe that our teams are part of a larger organization, and that we shouldn't be just doing what's convenient for the team. We should be doing what's best for the organization. And sometimes that's inconvenient for us. Sometimes we're collaborating with other teams in order to get the job done. Your team relies on my team to do something, and that's annoying for us, but we do it because that's best for the organization. It's best for our customers. So it's a more mature mindset. It also has some interesting management implications, because we believe in paying down technical debt. So one of the guidelines is to leverage and enhance organizational assets. So be intolerant of poor quality. Don't add to the technical debt. When you run into technical debt, try to pay it down if you can. So this enables our organizations to be more resilient and more streamlined and be able to react better, because it's easier to work with high quality assets than low quality assets. So because we believe in these principles, we make a collection of promises to ourselves as well as to the people that we collaborate. So we believe in psychological safety. We believe in embracing diversity. This leads to greater innovation. It leads to more enjoyable workspaces. We believe in collaborating proactively, both within our teams and with other teams. We make all of our work and our workflow visible, classic lean concept. And we want to improve continuously And this will help us to to improve our predictability. So one of the great things about Agile is if you're doing it right, it's more predictable than non-Agile ways of working. But it also depends on what you're trying to predict. So the serial community, the traditional community, tends to try to predict the wrong things, like, trying to predict being on budget and on schedule. Barely passes the who cares test with me. It's like, and with senior management too. Senior management tends to be a lot more interested in the question, are you spending the money wisely, rather than are you on budget? And that's an important nuance. They're far more interested in, are we shipping, are we getting things in the hands of a customer at the most appropriate time, versus are we on schedule? And those aren't the same thing in many cases. So these are very important nuances. And of course, those aren't the only outcomes we'd be interested in trying to predict. But what we try to predict and what we try to achieve is a very important driver of our behaviors. So we really so there's some cultural challenges that I would invite people to really think about. And that's a deeper conversation for another time. But I'll throw that hand grenade out there, and maybe you guys can deal with it at some point. So because we make these promises, we follow a collection of guidelines. So we want to validate our learning, take a validated learning approach. We want to apply design thinking. One of the interesting things about DA was we had design thinking embedded all the way through it for years, but we didn't make it explicit. We didn't point it out. And in the last couple of years, design thinking has really become critical, and people we started getting questions that, where's all, why don't you do any design thinking? Why aren't you talking about design thinking in DA? And I've got a master's in it, and I'm going, oh, are you kidding me? Like, look at that, and I just point, look at this, 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 look this, all design thinking stuff. Right. Oh yeah. How about that? But anyways, it's not that I'm bitter. So it's some basic lean concepts. You change the culture by changing the system, by changing the way that you work. So culture change follows practice change. It follows your approach, your process change. We want to create effective environments to foster joy. We spend a lot of our time working. A lot of our life is spent working. We should enjoy it. And there's been numerous studies that say that people enjoy what they do are more productive and more effective. So it behooves us as leaders, as managers, to create environments where people really enjoy what they do. We want to adopt measures that enhance our outcomes. We want to take an outcome-driven approach. Basically, also a reasonably interesting management fad lately, which is an important one. But we want to make things like that explicit, because that's been built into DA since pretty much day one. So that's the mindset, and this just is imbued throughout the toolkit, and it's a critical starting point. But an important philosophy in DA, which differs in many ways from mainstream Agile, is that mindset is important, but so is skill set. So you've got to have the right mental model in order to do the job, but you also got to have the skills to do the job as well. And a lot of Agile purists will only focus on mindset, or they're overly focused on mindset, which is important, but it's not the full game. So what is the scope? So one of the things that's interesting about the toolkit is we've architected it, and we very carefully have thought through how should this toolkit be built? How do we communicate it to the world? I'll go through one or two more slides, and I'll take a few questions again. So we have what we consider to be a 4-layer architecture. The first one is the foundation layer. And this is where the mindset is, and basic foundational concepts of Agile and Lean and teaming and roles and how do you choose your way of working are in the foundation. These are things that apply to all aspects of your organization. So it's the generic Agile stuff, the generic Lean stuff, the generic teaming and role stuff. Building upon that is our next layer. Just a second. Hi, honey. My daughter's here.
No worries.
Come on in. 100 some odd people want to see you.
A future change maker.
For me? I'll be up in a bit. Okay. I can't. I'm busy, honey. Sorry. Yes, future change maker. There we go. He's now shutting at me because I embarrassed her. Okay, anyway, so building on the foundation layer is DevOps. And this is discipline DevOps. This is table stakes for modern organizations. It used to be that agile software development was, and software development's great, don't get me wrong, but it's really the entire DevOps stack that's critical here. And it's enterprise class DevOps, not just, and I've got a slide coming on this, but not just the usual figure eight stuff of development and operations, which is critical, but also, how do you bring security? How do you do this in a secure manner? How do you bring data into this? How do you release things into production when you have, like if you've only got one or two teams, releasing stuff regular into production is not a big deal. What do you do when you've got dozens or hundreds of teams in flight in parallel? You might want to coordinate that a little bit, right? How do you support hundreds or thousands of systems in production? You might want to coordinate that one as well too, right? So there's a few enterprise class issues in DevOps that really make a huge difference. So the discipline DevOps approach brings all these things in. So instead of talking about DevSecOps, if everybody could go on mute, that would be great. But instead of talking about
always go this way.
If one of the Radu, if you could go on mute, or if one of the hosts can mute her or him.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so instead of treating DevSecOps and DataSecOps and these other things as or data DevOps as separate things, you've got to combine them, right? So we show you how to do that, and you get a slightly uglier picture than the cute infinite loop, but that's what you're actually dealing with. Building upon that are value streams. So how do we, and I've got a more detailed diagram coming from this in a minute, but how do we actually bring products and services to the customers or to the citizens in the case of government agencies, and then the rest of the organization? So how do we support our value streams? How do we take an agile or a lean approach to finance, to procurement, to vendor management, to people management, HR? How do we actually do that? Because all these groups can benefit from agile and from lean, and can and should be actively trying to get better, be actively trying to improve. So agile is about far more than just software. It's about far more than just IT. It really is, how do we bring it across to the entire organization? So a second ago, I was talking about DevOps. So this is the classic DevOps infinity loop, and that's a great start. But as we all know, there's more to it than that. Like, how do you bring security into play? How do you bring data into play, and so on? So it's not quite as pretty as the infinite loop, but you get when you start looking at how do you do an enterprise class DevOps, you end up with a picture like this. And we've got on PMI.org, we've got a detailed article that builds up from the infinite loop up to this sort of a diagram, and it takes it on one aspect at a time, and it puts all the diagrams together, which is why we get this slightly more complicated diagram. But this is what you're dealing with. So one of our philosophies in DA is to not hide talk away the not so pretty aspects of what's going on in our organizations. It's, we're dealing with complexity. So as a result, we end up with sometimes complicated solutions. So this diagram, I would argue, is a little more complicated than what you would typically see for DevOps, but this is a heck of a lot more accurate. So what do you want to do? And then I'll stop after this slide, and I'll take more questions. This is the workflow for the Flex life cycle, for the life cycle for a value stream. So Flex is all about how do we make value streams work from beginning to end and then continuing. So a value stream begins, ends, and hopefully continues, if you're successful, with the customer in mind. So what are their needs? How do we prioritize those needs? What are we going to bring to market to solve those needs, or bring to the market, bring to their citizens in the case of government agencies? How do we implement these solutions? Then how do we bring potential value to market? Not value, but potential value, because value isn't earned until it's in the hands of your customers and the customers receive the value. We don't declare earned value just because we've got just because we've got a release done, or just because we're at the end of the project. There is no value at that point. It's not until something's in the hands of the customers and they tell you it's valuable, they buy it, they use it, they take advantage of your service, whatever it is that you're bringing to market. And then we rinse and repeat. The process blades, these hexes are process blades or process areas. So the ones in the middle of the diagram are all supporting functions of the overall value stream. So if you're in a simple value stream or a small organization or a small part of an organization, then this might be one team doing all of this. If you're in a larger organization, so say you're in a bank or a government agency, this might be multiple teams working together in order to bring this value stream out to your customers. Now, what you want to do is you want to optimize flow at least throughout the value stream, if not across your organization, but certainly throughout this value stream. So you should always be trying to improve. You should always be trying to streamline this as much as possible. So that way you can bring value, these minimum business increments, to the market, or to your potential customers or to the citizens on a regular basis. Minimum business increment is our term for a minimal marketable release. Many people will use the term MVP. This is not an MVP. An MVP is an experiment. So about 90% of the people using the term MVP right now are using it improperly. An MVP is an experiment it's an investment in learning. I want to learn what my customers potentially want, or what services, what products they want, what features they want. An MBI is an investment in potential value. This is the real thing that we bring to market. So we learn with MVPs, we deliver MBIs. Most people will call their MBIs MVPs, and then they lose the benefit of MVPs, which is to experiment. But that's a whole other story too. But anyways, this is a good point to take a few questions if there's any.
You bet. There's a couple questions. Just as a reminder, we got about 12 to 13 minutes left. We're going to run out of time as usual, but we'll have you come back again in the future. But two questions. Number one, I have the slide deck. Can I share it with our participants today?
Yes. Yeah, I sent you the PDF specifically for that.
So, perfect. So everybody that's attending today, I will email it to you in the next 24 hours. Another question from earlier: has Discipline Agile identified combinations of practices that are incompatible with each other?
Yes. We don't explicitly call them out because there's 100 in the toolkit. We call out hundreds of practices, so that would be a many-to-many mapping. That would be a dog's breakfast. But we've actually thought along those lines in the past, and we tried it and it did not work. It's just a horrible traceability matrix. So the answer is yes. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's I would do this or I do this, but I wouldn't do both type of an issue. Sometimes it's if I do this, I'm shooting myself in the foot on this one. Or it just makes absolutely no sense to do that because, we covered it all. One way to look at things is in terms of risks. What risks, so when we adopt a practice, what risks are we paying down and what risks are increasing? Because any given practice has advantages, effectively paying down risks, and disadvantages, effectively increasing risks. So what risk profile are you willing to live with your way of working? Is the interesting question.
And one of the things, my experience as a project manager, we're very good at trade-offs. And so one of the things that I like about Choose Your Wow, Discipline Agile, is you lay out the circumstances in which a particular tool would be applicable, and the project manager can look at those trade-offs. Like you said, there could be risks in doing one technique over the other. So that's where project manager or scrum master or agile coach, or that's where the team can come in, look at the trade-offs and say, okay, what works for us? Context counts. Yeah. Choice is good.
Yeah. So let me go through. Let me get to the GCI section. I'll go through.
Yeah, that part's great. Yeah.
Yeah. I've only got a couple minutes, so I should. I'll speed things up here. Okay. So anyways, so how do you choose your wow? How do you choose your way of working? Because choice is good. Particularly when you spell it properly. So teams should, one of the things we talk about in DA is teams should choose their own life cycle. So when I walk into an organization, I can see that, some teams are doing some sort of a scrummish type thing. Some teams are doing some sort of a leanish type thing. Sometimes there's programs, sometimes there's projects, sometimes there's not projects. So these are all easy observations to make if you choose to. Yet most of the frameworks only support one life cycle. SAFe actually supports a couple now, so good for them. But for the most part, they all support one life cycle because that's just what they do. So in DA, we're not limited by the frameworks. So we have an agile project-based life cycle that's based on Scrum. We have a continuous delivery life cycle also based on Scrum, but that's for more of a long-standing product team, not a project team. We have so those are all Scrum-based life cycles. We have, my VPN just died. We have if I can get back to it, we have a lean Kanban-based project life cycle, a lean continuous delivery life cycle, more of a product team thing. So these are all based on Kanban. These two life cycles are project life cycles. These two life cycles are product long-standing team life cycles. We also support what we call an exploratory life cycle based on lean startup. So how do you explore new ideas, new potential innovations in the marketplace? This is where MVPs kick in. And how, of course, how do you do programs? So how do you do a team of teams? So, and then the interesting thing about our approach to team of teams is we don't enforce teams to have the same life cycle or even the same cadences. So where many of the scaling frameworks for Agile will say, here's how you do a team of teams, a team of Scrum teams, for example, and they'll say all these teams are doing Scrum, they all have 2-week iterations, and they're all working on a quarterly release cycle, whatever your numbers happen to be. In DA, we say, well, wait a minute, no, some teams might be doing lean, some might be doing Scrum, and that's okay. Some teams might have sprints, iterations, some might not. Some might have a 1 week or a 2 week or a 3 week, some, and that's okay. And as long as they line up every so often, and you've got the skills to coordinate, because having them on different cadences requires more sophisticated coordination. But if you've got the ability to pull that off, then you'll have a much better result in a program if you can coordinate. So we have a lot of techniques for coordination, for example. Now, one of the things that tend to freak people out when we start talking about how different teams will be doing different things and following different life cycles, it's, well, how do I govern this? How do I lead this? This is chaos. I can't, I've got to inflict the same process on all my teams, right? Because if I don't have a repeatable process, well, I can't possibly manage. Well, I would invite you to up your game. So one of the things we've done in DA is we've addressed this problem. Because this is a fair problem, right? You will govern, I hope you will govern your teams, and you should be governing them well. But if I have a team that's doing a Scrum project-based thing, another team doing a Kanban-based thing, another team doing traditional, those are different teams working in different ways. I can't have a single governance process to rule them all, right? Because a traditional team needs to be governed in a traditional way, an agile team in an agile way, right? And if I start mixing, and if I don't have an appropriate fit for purpose governance strategy that reflects the unique way that my teams are working, then the governance will probably do more harm than good. And this is the challenge of many organizations these days, right? When they go to adopt Agile, the PMO really sort of struggles at first to understand, because they've got their old way of governing, and that does not work for the Agile teams. And then you get a huge amount of fighting as a result. And the fault for the most part is the PMO. And I appreciate that's harsh, given the audience, but you got to call it like it is, right? And it's not that the PMOs can't govern an Agile team. Frankly, governing Agile teams is way easier than governing traditional teams. Frankly, the traditional teams are ungovernable. Any given, and this is also a topic for another day, but any given governance strategy in the traditional world, I can tell you how to get around it. And I will probably not get caught doing it. And I bet you in your organizations, if you're still doing traditional governance, I bet you've got teams that right now are faking the governance process. You might actually be managing some of them, but we're not asking that. And you're probably not going to get caught. So that's not governance. That's bureaucracy. Very hard to fake out Agile governance, though, because of the greater visibility. You can still do it, but it's way harder. I'm not going to tell you to do that. Anyways, so how do we choices? So instead of telling you what to do, we give you choices. So we describe agility, team agility in this case, in terms of a collection of process goals. Each of these process goals are described or summarized by a process goal diagram. Now, this is a reasonably straightforward one. How do we go about securing funding? So the way you read this diagram is that one of the goals here was secure funding for teams, right? So you gotta fund your project. So how do you go about doing that? Well, when I go to do that, I've got three basic decision points to think about. How do we choose our funding strategy? Because there's different ways that we can fund a team. What are we actually funding? Are we funding a team? Are we funding a project? Are we funding a line of business? And how we go about accessing the funds? How formal is the getting of money from whoever has the money? So we are implicitly making these decisions. Now, sometimes they're explicitly made by our framework because we're told this is the only way of doing things. This is the best practice. Or sometimes maybe finance is forcing a way of working on us. Maybe they insist on fixed price, or maybe they insist on fixed price with a range, right? Sure, you can make those work, but they're not that effective. So the way you read this diagram, and this I believe is the only example of a goal diagram, so it's not the greatest because it's really simple, but also all of the lists are ordered. They all have arrows beside them. And the arrow is an indication that the strategies towards the top of the list are generally more effective than the strategies towards the bottom of the list. So in some ways, that's a continuous maturity model for those of you who understand what continuous CMMI is all about. If you don't, then don't worry about it. If there was no arrow there, and sadly I don't have an example in this deck without an arrow, then it's an unordered list. So all those practices are good ideas in some situations and not others. In behind the scenes are descriptions of each practice, like a brief description, often a link to greater details if you so desire, but then a description of the trade-offs. So this is in the Choose Your WOW book, which you can download free of charge from PMI.org if you're a member. It's also in the DA browser tool, which you can access as a member as well at the PMI.org/DisciplinAgile site. And in the slides later on is a slide with URLs. So that's the way you can choose your WOW. Now, how do you do that? That's what guided continuous improvement is all about. So instead of adopting frameworks, or maybe you have, and that's great. How do you do better than that? So I would invite you to look at the organizations that are actually very effective. Who are the scary organizations out there? What's the FANGs? It's the Facebooks, the Apples, the Netflix, the Googles of the world. What I call the apex predators. These are the organizations that you would be very scared to have to compete against. These are the organizations that we all admire. But how did they get so scary? Well, they follow a technique from the lean community, and this is decades old now, called Kaizen, continuous improvement. And what they do is they follow a strategy that looks like this. So when they run into a problem, either something they want to improve or something that's just dysfunctional, then they say, hey, we got this problem, we should solve it. They then brainstorm how could we possibly solve this problem. They also identify how they're going to measure it. Then they try it out, they experiment. They give it a fair go. Then they assess how, one of the reasons why they identify the measures is they have to assess how effective this is going to be. Then, so they measure it, and if it worked out, they adopt it. If it didn't work out, they abandon it, right? Because sometimes they guess wrong and they have a failed experiment. And if they're polite, they share learnings. And then they rinse and repeat. So Apple got as good as they are, Facebook got as good as they are, because they've been following this process for years. Amazon is a classic example of an organization that does this. They've just been continuously improving for so long now. This is how they got so far ahead of us, right? So the question is, and so this works. So how effective is this? Well, the organizations that are doing continuous improvement, they enjoy an improvement curve that looks like this. It just keeps on going. Now it's actually jagged, right? Because some of the experiments are failures, so it goes down a bit, but then it goes back up, right? So, but over time it trends upwards, and they've been doing this for years, and they continue to do it. Like if you read any case studies about these companies, they're all very clear. They're constantly improving because they're all deathly afraid of some other organization like them catching up to them and getting better. This is why, like, Amazon is still improving, even though they're way ahead of everybody else. They're still actively improving because they know if they don't, they start to sit on their laurels, somebody else will catch up and wipe them out. So they're, it's good for them. So how can we do better at this? Well, the challenge is right here. Well, the symptom at least is right here. So when we try a technique out, sometimes they fail. And there's wonderful rhetoric that consultants will tell us, well, we want to fail fast, right? And certainly failing fast is better than failing slowly. It's cheaper, right? And it's faster and it's cheaper. So that's not so bad, but it's still failing. And of course, there's all this rhetoric that, well, it's not really a failure because we learned something. Well, you know what? Maybe, I could experiment with gravity, or I could, gee, I wonder if I can make this float, use my telekinetic powers to make it float. Didn't work. I did not need to run that experiment. There was no way that was going to work. That was a stupid experiment. That was a stupid change to experiment with, right? So why would we do that? Obviously nobody's going to do that unless they're drunk, but we're desperately looking for a quick example. But nobody's going to do that. But I'm sure you see all these failures in an organization where you try a technique and it just doesn't work out because it's being misapplied. So the next observation is, well, where's the real issue here? The real issue is in that second step, identifying the potential techniques. So if we can get better at identifying techniques that are more likely to work in the situation that we face, we'll have fewer failures. Now you're human, you're still going to make mistakes, but you'll have fewer of them. So the implication is your change effort is now faster and cheaper than with DA than if it wasn't, because you have fewer failures, because you still need to experiment, right? You still need to try new ways of working, but let's get better at doing this. Because even though we're in unique situations, if we have the humility to recognize, well, wait a minute, more than likely other people have solved this problem for us. If we can stand on their shoulders, if we can reuse their learnings, if we can, because we don't have to reinvent all these practices. Other people have already figured them out. For example, I was on a panel last month where somebody was saying how they had a globally distributed team and they were doing this, and they basically invented mob programming, didn't realize it, which is fine. They stumbled into it, but it was a phenomenally expensive way of doing that, rather than if they'd realized, oh well, here's a technique that somebody's already figured out. Let's read about it. Let's learn it. Let's get some coaching in it and move forward. It would have been faster. It would have been way better. Now their experiment sort of worked, but they stumbled along the way until they finally stumbled into an existing known technique. Well, it wasn't known to them because they weren't process experts. So how do we get better at identifying potential techniques? Well, you can hire expensive coaches. And I'm a firm believer in coaches. Don't get me wrong. You can hire expensive coaches if you know how to identify them, if you know how to attract them, and if you know how to keep them. And hopefully you can hire people that have been there and done that in the current situation that you face. Or you can also leverage a toolkit like DA that has this knowledge, that can bring these decision points to you and potential options to solve them. And because we go down, now I didn't show up, but we go down one step further and describe the trade-offs, now you can make better decisions. So you can identify, I'm not going to go back to that goal diagram, but if you remember, there was a bunch of techniques for choosing your funding strategy, for example, right? So if you know what the trade-offs are of those techniques, you can identify one that is more than likely going to work for you in your situation, given your current skill set, given your current culture, as opposed to just blindly saying, well, time and materials is what our Scrum coach tells us to do, because that's the only technique the guy knows. But there was 5 or 6 techniques there. Which one's best for you? I don't know, because I don't know you. But I do know there's choices, and I do know that you understand your situation, and I can help you to identify your potential choices and show you how to choose. So you can increase the chance. Because you could blindly try doing time materials, but that might be a high risk thing for you, for your situation. Who knows, right? There might be something that's a little bit lower risk that has a greater chance of succeeding. I would rather experiment with that. So this is what we call guided continuous improvement, and it's all about giving change makers the freedom of choice and to help them to make better decisions, to identify potential changes to experiment with that are more than likely going to be successful. So when we do that, where normal continuous improvement enjoys an improvement curve like that, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're not Apple, if you're not Amazon, and those companies are on the leading edge, they're dealing with problems that they're pretty much the only people that have stumbled into those problems yet. If you're even just a bit behind them, you can take advantage of all these other potential practices and strategies out there. So guided continuous improvement, because you will have fewer failures because you're making better decisions, identifying potential changes to experiment with, you enjoy a steeper curve. So you have better and you have a cheaper and faster process improvement. It's just basic math by that point. So this is the value prop for Discipline Agile. So our philosophy is, instead of adopting a framework, we suggest you improve in place. So start where you are. So if you're currently doing Scrum, you're currently doing Safe, great. We can help you to improve upon that. If you're currently doing traditional or some rule your own thing, great. That's your starting point. You're professionals. I know you're doing the best that you can in the situation that you face, because that's what good people do. But always strive to get better. Always be trying to experiment. Always be trying to look for better ways of working. And DA can help you to do that. So how do we learn more? Well, luckily, you've got a senior Scrum Master workshop coming up in May, 10th and 11th, if I'm not mistaken, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Sometime in May. So that's great. So that workshop is for people who are reasonably new to Agile. It goes far beyond Scrum. So it's not limited to Scrum. It really does, work through the toolkit. If you have a couple of years of experience, you might want to actually consider the DASSM, the Senior Scrum Master Cert, which is being offered virtually by a lot of vendors. We will soon have 2 other certifications out. The Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant is coming out actually the first week of April. I think we're actually, if you go to pmi.org, I think some of the vendors are now offering workshops in it, so it's effectively out. I think the first one is the first or second week of April, and then the Discipline Agile Coach will be coming out late May, early June. And so the Value Stream Consultant is all about, how do we build value streams? How do we do agile transformations within the organization, but mostly how do we make those value streams effective, because that's where you're making your money. So being good at that is probably a good idea. And coaching, the Discipline Agile Coach, is how do I coach Discipline Agile teams? How do I coach my team to get better, or a collection of teams to get better? But also, how do I interact when my team has to interact with another team? So for example, earlier I was talking about securing funding. Well, if my team has to go to secure funding, chances are pretty good I'm working with the finance people. So if the finance people are already working in a reasonably agile manner, great. But what if they're not? Then as a coach, I've got to help the team that I'm coaching, but also I should start maybe coaching the finance team and being able to work with them to allow my team to work in a more effective manner. But also, there's probably a coaching opportunity to help finance get more effective, or the procurement folks, or the enterprise architecture folks, or whatever. So the Discipline Agile Coach is all about, how do I coach different types of teams in the organization? So it's not just about coaching software teams. So this is a summary of the various prerequisites for each and purposes for each of those certs, including the ACP. So Dave answered this question earlier. So the ACP is one of the certs that is not going away. So if you're worried about that, don't ask. It's not going away, because the ACP is valuable. A lot of great stuff there. So why wouldn't we continue on with it? It's a good thing. So to wrap up, and hopefully I haven't gone too far over, my apologies. Success doesn't come from adopting a framework. Adopting a framework might be a great start, and it is a great start for many organizations, but it's only a good start. The real goal is to become a learning organization. It's to learn how to learn. It's to learn how to make effective change in your organization, to be truly a change maker. So the DA toolkit can help you to make better decisions, and even just to let you know what your options are and what the trade-offs are. It's absolutely valuable. Too many companies are reinventing the wheel. They've got the Scrum blinders on. They're really limited in their thinking because they've bought into the framework, and whatever that framework happens to be. And the frameworks will never tell you how to move away from the framework. Why would they, right? So, but that's what you need to do. It's a starting point, but it's only a starting point. You've really got to learn how to break out of method gel. So I would invite you to learn more about Discipline Agile. We've got some great resources. The primary resource is probably pmi.org/Discipline Agile, and that's that's the DA hub from which you can find all things DA. Certainly Google as well is a great resource, I guess. And we've got some great blogs on projectmanagement.com as well. So it's not just pmi.org, although we do link to them from pmi.org, obviously. So anyways, thank you very much. I'm happy to stay and take questions. I appreciate I'm probably 10 or 15 minutes over. My bad. But hopefully it's the rutabaga thing, right? It was rutabaga.
Yeah, no,
Totally
exactly.
blew my timing.
Exactly. And you did mention one of my favorite parts of Choose Your Wow are the process goals. 5 years doing Scrum, being forced to use user stories for every single situation was enough to drive me crazy. And also, one of the things that I found is beneficial, I got the free electronic copy of Choose Your Wow, but I also actually literally bought the book because I just find the process goals are easier to follow in text versus electronically.
I like paper too. Yeah, it's actually, I can't remember the number, but Mark Klein, one of Mark's hot buttons is user stories. And he counted the number of requirements techniques that we've got. I think it's 31 is what comes to mind. It's 30 or 40. And actually we're just about to add a few more. So what his number is now wrong. We'll soon be wrong. But it's not just user stories. And and user stories are great in certain situations, but they're certainly not the end all to be all. How the heck, I'm sure some of you work in organizations where you might have a data model or two describing your logical models. You might even have some physical models, right? So user stories don't get the job done for data stuff. They don't get the job done for architecture stuff and many, many other things. They're a great usage requirement technique, but that's it. And they're one of many usage requirement techniques. Some of you might remember use cases, for example. Which seem to be coming back in vogue. I hear more and more people. I think once the design thinking stuff is becoming more popular, I'm seeing use cases come more and more in vogue.
You won't believe this, Scott, and the rest of the audience. I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I got this. It's a fashion magazine, and it's a model wearing pants. And literally, the copy on this ad it says use case for a pair of pants, and these are to work from home or for the weekend. So I didn't realize I needed a use case for pants, but it is making a comeback.
Well, that's good to know because I really wasn't sure what these pants things were all about.
But actually, after a year,
finally somebody's telling me. Yeah.
Exactly. You've been using them wrong the entire time.
Yeah.
No,
and your head? What?
That was one of my favorite slides from the presentation you did last week. Was a framework like Scrum will have one technique or two, and Disciplined Agile will have 53 or whatever. It will have just a lot more choices, which goes back to something that you said throughout, and that is choice is good. Well, I do want to be respectful for everybody's time. So thank you very much, Scott. This was fantastic. Would love to have you come back in the future. A lot more that we can talk about. Why do IT projects still fail? Increasing agility in the federal government. We didn't get to any dad jokes, so I hope you will come back in the future and
I would love to. And I hope to get back. I actually used to live in Tyson's Corner.
Really? Excellent.
I consider the DC area to be, a second or third home, I guess we call it. But
when we're allowed to meet face to face, we'll fly you down here and we'll have you present in person.
Hopefully later this year.
I hope so too. I hope the vaccine rollout in Canada is as fast as it looks like it's going in the United States.
It's a little behind, but we're going to catch up. We're catching up now. So it's
excellent. Good to hear.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. As I said, I will send out Scott's slides here within the next 24 hours. I hope to see everybody at future events. We do about 5 or 6 per month. I hope to see you in April and May. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.